Hi, I'm Vani Shukla. Welcome to Garden and Nature Southwest. For today's episode, I have chosen the topic of soil ecosystem. And let me tell you why. When I first started gardening in the desert climate, I was finding it quite challenging to grow the vegetable plants or to grow non-native ornamental plants. And if my plants had any particular issue, let's say if I wanted more vegetable production or if I wanted their foliage healthier, I would try to find a way to address that particular issue. If there was a pest problem or a disease, then I would try to find a remedy for that. And this was quite frequent, even though overall, yes, the gardening was rewarding and I have been a passionate gardener forever. So I was not going to just quit gardening. However, I wanted to see what else I could do to make it easier and to make my plants, make my garden thrive. So that's when my learning process started about everything else, not just plants, but what else is going on in the garden. And garden ecosystem, the concept of ecosystem, was quite familiar to me. I had studied that in depth. However, for some reason, that was in a distance, out in nature. It was not in my garden for some reason. It did not cross my mind that I'm not dealing with that. I'm not paying attention to that. My whole focus was my plants because obviously that's what I was seeing in the garden. My plants, that's what gardening is all about. Having beautiful plants, having a beautiful design, how you arrange your garden beds and all that. That is what gardening was to me and is to a lot of people for obvious reasons. I was not paying attention to what was going on in the background, which was not visible. So as I learned more to solve these issues and to have a healthier garden overall, I came across the soil ecosystem and later on the rest of the ecosystem. And then, of course, it clicked. Why was I not paying attention to this? Of course, plants do not exist in isolation in the garden. They have an ecosystem, and if we pay attention to the whole garden ecosystem, we are very likely to have a healthier garden. Now, the topic of garden ecosystem is quite big, so I decided to just go over the soil ecosystem today, and in subsequent episodes, I will go over other aspects of garden ecosystem as well. So today I will be going over some general principles of how you can create a healthy soil ecosystem. By general principles, I mean you can apply these things to any kind of garden, whether you have a vegetable garden or a non-native ornamental garden, or you have native plants primarily from a desert climate, or any other sort of garden in any kind of climate. These are the things that hold true for all soil types and all garden types. But these are the essentials of creating this healthy ecosystem, this balanced ecosystem. So I am going to go over those briefly, but then I will go over some specifics also. Specifics about a particular garden, let's say vegetable or fruit garden or a native plant garden in the desert climate. I will go over those things briefly, not in a whole lot of detail, but briefly. And then also some specific challenges that we face in the desert soil, especially when you want to grow vegetable plants or non-native plants. Now, while going over these, I will also go over some questions that often come up. For example, should we use fertilizers to improve plant health? If we come across a nutrient deficiency, should we try to replace that? For example, should you add calcium or magnesium or iron to your soil to fix the deficiency symptoms that you're seeing in your plant? Now, another important part of a soil ecosystem or any ecosystem is the microbial life. And these days we have commercially available microbes and other organisms that you can add to your soil in order to improve the microbiota. But is it good? Is it good to add those things? I'm going to address that as well. So in the general principles, the first thing that I would like to start with would be to avoid all sorts of chemicals in the soil. Even if spraying chemicals on the plants, any pesticides on the plants, it's eventually going to end up in the soil. And why do we want to avoid any chemicals? By chemicals, I also mean the chemical fertilizers. the individual nutrients, fertilizers that are intended to fix a particular deficiency. We want to avoid those too. So why avoid pesticides? Well, the one obvious reason is, of course, it's going to harm us also indirectly. It eventually ends up in our food and water system, so it is going to harm us. Also, it is going to harm the soil ecosystem. Even if you're spraying it on the plant, eventually it does end up in the soil. And there's a lot of microbial life and larger life forms in the soil. They get harmed by these chemicals. And these life forms are very essential to making that ecosystem strong. Without them, we cannot have a system where plants can absorb their nutrients well or can defend themselves. These are integral parts of having that strong immune system for the plants, or where the plants are absorbing all the nutrients that are present in the soil, or at least the nutrients that are needed by the plants are made available to them by these microbes. So we definitely want to see that they are healthy. And so for their sake, we have to avoid using any kind of chemicals. Chemical fertilizers, why? Why do we need to avoid those? Well, because first of all, when we try to fix something by just looking at the plant symptom, let's say the color of the leaf is looking different and you diagnose it with any particular nutrient deficiency, you're trying to fix that problem. But unfortunately, there's no way of knowing what exactly is the problem. Is the soil really deficient in that nutrient? Or is it just a problem with the absorption? A lot of times, especially with the desert soil, this is an issue where we have issue with the absorption of the plant. Now, this is not just the desert soil or the pH issue. There are so many unknown factors that are going on that may hinder the absorption of any particular nutrient. It may be related to not having the appropriate microorganisms that help plant absorb the nutrients, or this problem might be due to other competing elements, other elements that block the absorption of a calcium or a magnesium or iron or whichever nutrient a plant is trying to absorb, but another different kind of element present in the soil is not letting that happen. There's an imbalance. There's an imbalance going on in the soil. Now, if without knowing what exactly is the underlying cause of the issue, we just blindly add a nutrient, are we doing any good? Maybe we're just oversaturating it, and then yes, temporarily we might see a response that the plant's symptom improve because in that area we have just saturated the soil with that nutrient. So that deficiency may be resolved and you might feel happy that you fixed the problem. But did you really fix the underlying issue? We don't know. There is so much unknown. Even though science has made so many amazing discoveries and we know so much more about soil and ecosystem and everything, but still largely most of the things are still unknown. So we have to respect that also. So that's the reason I do not find adding a particular nutrient to fix a deficiency is a long-term solution. Instead, if we just focus on supporting that ecosystem becoming strong itself so that it is able to provide what is needed by the plant, then we don't have to worry about these individual issues. And that's what we are learning today, how to strengthen that ecosystem. So adding chemical fertilizers or adding any pesticides. And by chemical fertilizers, I also mean, sometimes they say, oh, this is all natural or this is organic fertilizers. I don't believe in that also. I rather strengthen the ecosystem in the most natural way possible, in a more holistic way, rather than supplementing individual nutrients like this is calcium, phosphorus, or this is just magnesium. So rather than that, a more holistic approach might be more beneficial. Another principle super important in any kind of soil or garden is to avoid digging or tilling the soil. And in this case too, one of the biggest reasons is we are going to be disturbing the life inside the soil if we turn it over. If we turn over the soil, we're going to be exposing that life to sunlight and to air outside. These microorganisms and insects and other beings live in the depths of soil for a particular reason. That is what their nature is. That's how they survive. That's how they thrive. So we have to just leave them there where they are, let them do their thing. If we expose them to outside, we're going to be making it difficult for them. A lot of them are going to be harmed by this. The mycorrhizal fungi that is making that extensive network beneath the soil is also going to be disturbed when we turn over the soil. Now, sometimes a question comes up that, well, my soil has these root knot nematodes, or I have these other soil pests that are somehow destroying my plants. And so turning over the soil may help kill those soil pests. So for this, well, the first thing is that we may not know for sure what exactly is the pest that is causing the problem and what's the solution for that. It's most of the times a guesswork. Even if we have identified the symptoms related to that particular disease, we do not know if it is the pest that's the issue, or is it just that the plant itself has a weakened immune system for some reason because of its own seed genetics, or is it due to some other reasons? Maybe it's lacking the cooperation of some other helpful microorganisms that usually protect it, and those microorganisms are not there. So these other organisms acting as pests may not be in great numbers, but it's just that they find this particular plant vulnerable. So first issue is that we do not know exactly what's causing that pest problem. The second issue with turning over the soil is, again, when you are trying to kill the pest, you are also going to be killing a lot of beneficial organisms. So if we leave the soil as such, the concern one might have is, okay, well, then how am I going to get rid of the pest? Well, that's the beauty of an ecosystem. We don't have to go and micromanage these things. We just focus on strengthening that ecosystem in the soil, that balance in the soil. Now, how do we know that the pests are not going to be overpowering if we leave the soil as such? Well, for this, I think about just looking around in the nature. Whenever the ecosystem is in balance, not just the soil, but the whole garden, whole nature ecosystem in a particular climate in a particular region. For example, if you're looking at a desert ecosystem, you have that particular soil. The plants go along with that soil. They are very well adapted to that soil. There's a good harmony. It's always promoting plant growth. If it's a forest ecosystem, if it's a tropical environment or any other kind of environment where you have a rich organic matter in the soil, that kind of ecosystem is also promoting certain types of plants. So it's a good match between the soil and the plants and the rest of the ecosystem. When there's a good match, there's always a balance towards plant growth, not the other way. So if the ecosystem is strong and balanced, you will have plant growth. If it was not the case, plants will not have survived on Earth. So the nature prefers that kind of balance where plant growth is allowed. If in our garden we are not seeing that plant growth, we are seeing our plants struggling, then there are certain things that are not right in the whole ecosystem. Not just the soil ecosystem, but the whole ecosystem. But for today's topic, we're just discussing soil ecosystem. So for the soil, yes, temporarily there might be some pest issues. There might be some other nutrient deficiencies and other issues. But eventually, as you continue to support the ecosystem, as you continue to add the ingredients that will create this robust ecosystem, then these problems will be less and less as time goes on. And this is so freeing because then you don't have to stress over each of these little problems. And it is true that we also have to learn to accept some losses in the beginning and later on also. But overall, the garden becomes a lot more productive and beautiful. Now, next thing related to this is keeping the soil covered by mulch. The kind of mulch depends on the type of garden, but the general principle is not to keep the soil exposed. Even if it's a native plant garden, the mulch might be different. I'm talking about the native plants in desert climates. They do not require a whole lot of organic matter, So just the leaf litter that falls on the ground is usually sufficient for these succulents or other desert native plants. But if you have non-native plants or edible garden, then in that case, a lot of organic matter is required. And mulching with any sort of organic mulch is also helpful because over time, the bottom layer, the layer that is in contact with the soil, will also continue to decompose and it will become an additional source of nutrients. So keeping the soil covered is a key. It provides a better temperature regulation. It also prevents the soil, the topsoil, from eroding out, from blowing out in the wind. There are many organisms that like to hide under the mulch that might be also beneficial for the plants. And these insects and other organisms are different from the organisms that stay underneath the soil. So you need that layer of life as well, helping your plants. Another important thing is to, in general, have more plants on the soil. Not to have the soil bare without plants, because the more plants you have, the more plant roots that there are, they will keep the soil bound together and prevent it from eroding or being lost with water or air. Now, you might have a garden design where you do not want a dense, thick garden. That's okay. If you have a garden design where you're just planning to have a few larger bushes, that's it, then in that case, either the rest of the area has some very low ground cover, or if it's a vegetable or fruit garden, you can have some flowering plants or herbs. Again, depending on the design, the size may vary, and you can still achieve the design objective, but you will giving that additional benefit of more roots growing in the soil. Having a lot of variety of plants also helps in another way. It brings in a diversity of organisms in the soil. So that is another way how having more plants of different types is helpful to the soil. And the more variety, more diversity of organisms that you have in the soil, they each have their own benefits. They each have their specialties. Some might help to strengthen the immune system of a plant. Others might help for water absorption or sending signals to the plants, or they serve so many different purposes. And so the more variety there is, the better it is. If you have a native plant garden, you can have small grasses, different kind of grasses also along with the larger plants. So there are quite a number of choices for plants to fit in the kind of design that you want. Now, as a general principle, it is also good to understand what this microbial life in the soil is all about. And we know, as with many other things, we know just a fraction of what is present in the soil, the complex processes that are going on in the soil. So sometimes we may imagine that the nutrients that are present in the soil, or if we are adding any organic matter or any sort of nutrients to the soil, the plants will be able to just absorb it. It will just go in the plant through its roots, and the plant will be able to utilize it. However, a lot more goes on at the cell level. Each plant cell has these channels which open and close to absorb a particular nutrient or to let things out of the plant that the plant does not need. But these opening and closing of these channels in each individual cell happens as a response to some signals that a plant is sending. If it needs something, then it sends that signal. But it's not just the plant. Sometimes it is the organisms that are working with the plant. They work together. These microorganisms also work on these nutrients to change their form, because a nutrient may be present in the soil in a certain form that the plant cannot absorb at all. It is of no use to the plant. But because that microorganism is present, it changes the form of that nutrient, and now the plant is able to use that in a much easier way. Now, why are these microorganisms helping? Well, the plants are helping them in return. Probably the plant is providing them some nutrients or some other protection. So it is a very complex system, great symbiosis going on, and there are thousands and thousands of species of microorganisms. And some of them are highly specialized. Same thing goes with the plants. There are thousands of species of plants, and not every species works with every species of the microorganisms. They have their preferences, and usually they work with the organisms that they have evolved with for millions of years. And the more diversity we have of the microorganisms and of the plants, the better chance that the soil will have everything that the plants need, that different plants need. And this is one of the reasons why I don't think it's a good idea to buy microorganisms commercially and add it to your soil. So one common theme is that we do not know what's going on exactly. So just blindly adding something is not a good idea. But here, another important reason is that when we buy these commercially available cultures, these commercially available organisms, and add to the soil, we are sort of doing the same thing that we talk about when we're talking about monocultures of plants, that we are growing the same kind of plants and we are lowering the diversity of plants. Well, exactly the same thing's going to happen with the microorganisms and other organisms in the soil if we are all throughout the country, throughout the world, are adding similar cultures, similar species. Yeah, there may be a number of them, but still, compared to what's in there, it's nothing. And also, we do not know, is it what we need? Is that the one that we need in that particular location and for that particular purpose, for that particular plant species? It is just too complex for us to figure out and just simply add something, buy something and add it to the soil. It is too simplistic in my opinion. So the question is, well, if the soil is deficient in particular thing, if we are dealing with a desert soil that never had these kind of organisms, then we got to bring it from somewhere. Actually, no, this is the magic, sort of a magic of nature, that when you provide the substrate, when you provide the ingredients, these organisms show up. When the conditions are right, they show up, they grow in populations. So what would be the ingredients for good, diverse soil microbial life and other insect life? Adding a variety of organic matter, diversity of organic matter. Whatever plants you have growing in the garden, instead of throwing it out, just compost them in place, or if you have a dedicated composting place, compost it and then add those. Also, buy good organic compost from outside if you have a reliable nursery, a local nursery where they make their own compost. This is something that I am fortunate to have in my area, that a nursery which follows all organic practices and they don't use any pesticides or chemicals for growing their plants. They make their own compost at a very large scale, even though it is several miles away from the city limits, but I think it is still worth going to a place where you can find good compost. But even if such a place is not available at your location, these days there are many other options for getting organic compost. But of course, to increase the variety, any organic matter, I add even weeds as long as it has not seeded. So all those dandelions that are growing, if they have not flowered, if they've not gone to that bud stage, I put all the dandelions to the compost. So the more variety that goes in, and initially when you're just starting your garden, then you can add these other things too, the liquid seaweed and cow manure, chicken manure, bat guano, all sorts of things, a little bit, but you don't necessarily need to keep adding it forever. I think initially it's okay, but afterwards it's a good amount of compost from diverse sources that will continue to build your garden soil and the microbial life. So buying microbes or any other kind of soil organisms, in my opinion, is not a good idea. In the beginning, I had a lot of issues with the root knot nematodes also, and I was looking at all the options, but thankfully by the time I was already well aware of the fact that I needed to strengthen the ecosystem naturally and not bring in microorganisms from outside. So thankfully, I just trusted that process and continued to do that. And the root knot nematode problem also resolved after a couple of years of gardening. And I had to make some other adjustments, which I can go over in a future episode, but I never bought any soil microbes, and things have worked just fine. Garden has continued to grow stronger and has become easier and easier to maintain. Now, after knowing all this, we also want to address some specific issues, meaning that you're in a desert climate, in a southwest region, which is not really conducive to growing tropical plants or growing vegetable plants or healthy fruit trees. What do you do in that case? One common issue that we come across is that the soil is bad. Well, my perception has changed over the years, and I do not anymore see the soil good or bad. I just see it as a mismatch of the ecosystem and the plants that you're trying to grow. So if we're trying to grow vegetable plants or the fruit trees in a desert arid climate, we just have to change in that small area where you're trying to grow the vegetable or fruit garden. Change soil over time, build that ecosystem that matches with the plants that you're trying to grow. One important thing, and that's a general principle for any type of garden also, is that it's going to require some time. It's not an instant process. It takes time. Sometimes when we are starting a garden, what comes to mind is that, okay, let's just put the plants in and the garden is going to be pretty. And if it's a vegetable garden, it's going to be starting to produce soon. However, the first year or the first season that you start, you may have more problems. But as you continue to strengthen your soil, then in the following seasons and following years, you will find that your plants are getting stronger. It's easier to grow those plants. So it does take some time. The results are gradual. So it's not that you have to wait for 2 years before seeing any results. Yes, you will be having some results. If you're putting in all these ingredients for the ecosystem, you will be having some results gradually. And over the years, it will just continue to increase. So specifically for the vegetable garden, a common issue that we have in the desert soil is that the plants start to have nutrient deficiencies. You might see the plant's leaf get very pale, or they may get discolored in some ways. And they are often linked to a variety of different nutrients that the plant is not able to absorb. So it's not that the minerals are not there in the soil. If you see, actually, the desert soil is quite rich in minerals. There is a lot of calcium. Their limestone is just full of calcium in there, but it is not available to the plants. Either the right kind of microbes are not present. So it is not available to the vegetable plants or the edible or the non-native plants. The native plants, which are growing in the desert climate, are quite adapted to it. Even in that sort of environment, they are fully capable of absorbing whatever they need. It is the other kind of plants. So the nutrients are present, but they are not present in a form, or the right kind of microbes are not present to help absorb the nutrients. And one issue, and I just mentioned, it's just one known issue. There's so many other issues that we may not know about. One known issue is that the pH is very high. It's a very alkaline soil in a desert climate. That alkaline soil inhibits the absorption of many of these nutrients for these non-native plants, for the vegetable plants, for fruit trees. So sometimes a recommended solution is to add sulfur to reduce that pH, to make it more acidic. And in this situation also, I think it is a very limited approach. It is a very short-term solution, and may even end up creating some other imbalances, some unintended consequences as well. The one thing that we got to look at is, what is it in nature? What kind of places that we see low pH? So it's usually the forest environment. Usually the environment where there's a lot of vegetation, thick green vegetation, a lot of rainfall, a lot of organic matter. Because when there's thick vegetation, all that plant material, when that falls, when that dies, it decomposes. That's what creates all that organic matter. That keeps adding the organic matter to the soil. So lots of organic matter and lots of rain. Those places are associated with acidic pH. So that's a key component. The microbial life that comes in is associated with that kind of environment. A lot of organic matter, a lot of rainwater. So if we try to recreate that, it may not be exact. We're not going to have all the other aspects of the ecosystem. The moisture in the air, the temperatures, and all those other conditions are not there. But if just talking about the soil, and if we try to recreate those environments that are associated with acidic pH, then we might have a little bit more success rather than just adding sulfur or just adding another acidic product to lower the pH. When I was first learning about all these things years ago, and whichever problem I looked at and would go deep into learning about how things work in nature, how things work under the soil and ecosystem and all that stuff, one thing that it kept bringing me back to was more organic matter. If I wanted something for the non-native plants, if I wanted a good non-native garden like a vegetable garden, edible garden, then everything kept pointing back to add more organic matter. So whether it's a nutrient deficiency, whether it's a pest problem, whether you want more microbial life, whatever it is, it keeps going back to organic matter. And it is so true, because in that case, we are mimicking nature. And in nature, the balance is towards plant growth, towards making plants healthier. Organic matter is the key here also to make your soil more acidic. And it is going to take time, but you will start to see results soon. Let me give you another example of that. This is more recent, in last 2 or 3 years. We had moved to a new place. I started the garden from scratch again here. It's a very rocky soil, high in salt and lime. It just appears pale. And in this soil, I wanted to grow a Concord grape. And I'm well aware that it is not suited to this climate. It is not suited to the soil here. But I just love the taste of Concord grape, and I wanted one. So I put that in ground 2022. This is not in a raised bed or anything. It is just in the ground. Dug a hole, put a lot of compost and some topsoil also, and put that in. For a few weeks, it was okay. And then I started seeing problems in the leaves. They were just so pale. The vine was struggling. I just left it like that. I had already added quite a bit of compost and organic matter, whatever I could, and I just left it. There are a lot of other plants growing further from it. The next year, 2023, this area was pretty much taken over by plants that had self-seeded. A lot of chocolate daisies, some salvias, some coneflowers. These are plants that are there in my native plant garden, and they tend to reseed. And these plants, I guess, did not mind all that organic matter that I had placed for that Concord vine. This area became very thick. The vine was almost hidden. I didn't even check that vine. Now, this year, this spring, 2024, I go over there, and the Concord vine has huge leaves and throwing out so many different shoots with bunch of grapes, and there's no problem of pale leaves or anything like that. So what has happened? I think what has happened is, over time, in these past 2 years, all the other plants that came in, plus all the leaf litter that was falling, all the organic matter that I had initially placed, it was changing that soil inside. It was creating that ecosystem, which is associated with a thick, dense plant region. And it's true, there are some times that it's just not going to work. But at times you will be able to recreate these things. Now, of course, it is easier when you have raised beds, like I have in my vegetable garden. I knew the soil was like this, very rocky, very difficult to dig. So we made raised beds for our vegetables. And again, that ecosystem is building there with a lot of organic matter in there. So whether it's raised beds or on ground, eventually with time, you can recreate the kind of ecosystem, the kind of soil you're aiming for. Another component that can help make the soil more acidic is the rainwater, because as we know, this is another component of places that have lower pH. And of course, we get very little rain in the desert climate. So collecting rainwater might help, even if you collect a little bit, even if you're not able to do all your irrigation with rainwater. It is still helpful to have more number of days with rainwater. It's not going to achieve the exact kind of environment, but still, helps. Whatever little thing helps, it's good. Because our city water is quite alkaline, and that adds to that alkaline pH. So that's not helping either. Now, one more thing, especially more important in the desert climate, is never to use sprinklers. Always use the drip irrigation. This is not only to conserve water, that's true, that's very important, but another reason for not using sprinklers is that most of the city water in the desert climates is alkaline. In most places, some places it may not be, but the places where it's alkaline water, high salt content, that salt deposits on the foliage, on the plants. So sometimes you may see this kind of white deposit, and it may even look like a fungal disease. But fortunately, in desert climate and dry climates, we don't get that much fungal disease. But this is a common problem that may look like a fungal disease. It's just the salt deposited on the leaves, and that may harm the leaves. So you'd never want to use sprinklers. Some other things by which you can help the soil temperature, because remember, these are all important components of building a good soil ecosystem. Soil ecosystem is not just the organic matter or the microbial life, but water, what kind of aeration you have in the soil, what kind of soil temperature, all those things combined form that healthy, balanced ecosystem. So to keep the soil temperatures in a favorable range for your vegetable garden or non-native gardens, it's good to have trees. It's good to have some shade, or maybe grow the garden on the east side so that there's some afternoon shade. All these things can help the soil temperatures. Having trees is the best of these all. For vegetable gardens, you don't want trees that have dense shade. So oak trees may not be the best thing, but mesquite trees or palo verde or desert willow, those are good choices. They have dappled shade, and the vegetables will do really good underneath. Plus, all the leaves will provide for additional organic matter. They will also help with the dry winds, because again, the dry winds sometimes tend to blow off all the organic mulch and the soil underneath. So having trees in the area, even if it's a small space, you can have just one tree and make your plant beds under the canopy of, let's say, a large mesquite tree or a palo verde. That can work. So in summary, if it's a native garden, then we don't have to do a whole lot. But again, to support the ecosystem, you want to leave the leaf litter in place. There's not a whole lot of dense foliage on these plants, so you're not going to get a thick build of organic mulch. And that's what these plants want. That's what the soil is all about. Some of these native plants also tolerate a higher amount of organic matter. So overall, it's going to be fine. You can use some rock mulch or crushed gravel, these kind of mulches also for the native garden. And drip irrigation is important. If you can get rainwater, it's important. But for the native gardens, it's not a big deal, even if we are providing the city water. And there are so many plants that do well even without any irrigation. So native plant gardens are much, much easier. However, we want our vegetable and edible gardens also, and we might have our favorite non-native plants that we want to grow. So for those, we want to mimic the environment that is conducive to those kind of plant growth. And today I just went over the soil ecosystem, but it is the whole garden ecosystem that is important. The soil ecosystem is not in isolation. It's easier to go over each of them as different categories, but in reality, they all work together. That soil ecosystem will not survive without plants. Those plants are affected by not only the soil underneath, but also what's going on around them, the insects, the birds, the larger animals, the wind, the moisture outside. All those elements are working together to create that garden ecosystem. So soil ecosystem was today. In the following episodes, I'll go over the other aspects as well. I hope you found this information helpful. Thank you for listening. Until next time, bye-bye.